Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're focusing on a single date, November 8th. We're going to be going through history and looking at all the different events and the people who are connected to this day.
You know, it's interesting
Yeah.
when you think about it that way. You can kind of see how one single date echoes through different cultures and different time periods.
Yeah, it's not just a list of events. It's more like we're trying to connect them all and see the bigger picture.
Exactly, yeah.
And speaking of different cultures, before we jump into November 8th in the Gregorian calendar, we should acknowledge that in the Islamic calendar, this date actually falls on the 29th of Rabi al-Thani,
Right.
which is 1446 AH. And just as a reminder, the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, so the dates shift every year compared to the Gregorian calendar.
It really kind of highlights how our concept of time is really just a cultural thing.
Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating when you think about it that way,
Yeah.
as we're going through these events across centuries.
Okay, so let's get into some of these events. We'll start with a date that signifies both a beginning and an end. 1519, Hernan Cortez entered the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan.
And, you know, this was a huge moment. It was a pivotal moment in the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire.
Yeah.
Like, imagine two worlds colliding.
Right.
You have advanced weaponry and disease brought by the Spanish, and then you have this sophisticated society and military strategies of the Aztecs.
Right.
It was a real clash of civilizations that completely reshapes the Americas.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. Fast forward almost 500 years to 2017, and on the same date, the Syrian army took back the city of Abu Kamal,
Yeah.
which was the last city that was being held by ISIS in Syria. So this was a big turning point in the fight against ISIS. It pretty much ended their control of the region.
You know, it's a reminder that this battle for power and for territory is still going on in our world.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of interesting to think about these two events, you know, centuries apart. They show us this cyclical nature of history, this rise and fall of empires.
Yeah.
It's like a pattern that just keeps repeating itself throughout history.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of power shifts and empires, November 8th has seen some really dramatic political turning points.
Oh, yeah.
Like in 1620, the Battle of White Mountain happened near Prague,
Right.
and that was the beginning of the 30 Years' War.
Yeah, you can think of Europe at this time as this really delicate tapestry of kingdoms and duchies all kind of interconnected.
Right.
And then somebody comes along and just lights that whole tapestry on fire. The 30 Years' War, it wasn't just about religion. It was about power and territory. It pulled in every major power in Europe and left scars that lasted for generations.
Yeah, it's crazy how one event can have such a lasting impact.
Absolutely.
And then centuries later, on that same date in 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president of the United States.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
This brought in this whole new era of American politics. I mean, Camelot, as it came to be known.
Right.
And it really ignited this sense of hope and idealism, especially among young people, and not just in America, but all around the world.
It's so interesting how one date can hold events that are so different.
Yeah.
But they both represent these huge shifts in history.
Yeah, definitely. And we're sticking with the theme of empires here. November 8th is also tied to the history of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
In 1687, Sultan Mehmed IV was removed from power.
Yeah. And it wasn't just like a normal change in leadership. This really signaled the beginning of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. This once massive and powerful empire began to lose control of its territories, and its role in the world just kind of shrunk.
Right.
Sad when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. But even as the empire was declining, they were still trying to make changes, trying to reform.
Oh, yeah.
In 1864, they tried to modernize their provincial administration system.
You know, imagine you're trying to update the operating system on a really old, massive computer. That's kind of what the Ottoman Empire was trying to do.
Right.
Streamline the bureaucracy, be more efficient, and maybe, just maybe, regain some of their lost influence. It really shows the struggles that any institution or even an empire faces when it's trying to keep up with a world that's changing so fast.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we can definitely relate to even today. It's everywhere.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's move away from politics for a bit
Sure.
and talk about culture. November 8th, 1793 is a really important date in the art world. It's when the Louvre Museum in Paris first opened to the public.
Think about that art. Art used to be just for royalty, you know, rich people.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, it's open to everyone. Imagine the impact, all that inspiration, the knowledge being shared, the conversations that must have started because of that. This was the French revolutionaries. They turned the Louvre from a royal palace into a symbol of democracy and enlightenment.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. And it set this precedent for museums all over the world. It turned them into places for public education and enjoyment, something that we kind of take for granted today, I think.
For sure, for sure. And then, on a completely different note, in 1992, Japan got a huge win. They won the AFC Asian Cup for the first time. They beat Saudi Arabia in the final.
Yeah, and this wasn't just any other game. This was a big moment for Japan. They had been rebuilding and really working hard to come back on the world stage after World War II. And this win, beating a regional powerhouse like Saudi Arabia, it really showed that Japan was a force to be reckoned with in international football.
Yeah, it shows how powerful sports can be.
Yeah,
It can bring a whole nation together and give them a sense of pride and accomplishment.
it really is amazing how just this one date, November 8th, can hold both these moments of triumph and moments of real tragedy.
Yeah.
You know, it really shows you how complex human history is.
And you know what's interesting is how some of these events, even though they're separated by so much time, they still have similar themes. Like we've already talked about the struggle for power and how empires rise and fall. But there's another theme on November 8th that pops up: conflict,
Yeah.
and how conflict really ripples through society.
Exactly. And we see that, from the 30 Years' War in 1620, which we already talked about,
Yeah.
all the way to more recent conflicts like the Siege of Fallujah in 2004 in Iraq.
Yeah, the 30 Years' War, like we discussed, it basically reshaped the political map of Europe.
Right.
It was driven by all this religious tension, but it had huge economic and social effects.
Yeah.
Whole regions were completely devastated.
Yeah.
And it changed the balance of power for centuries.
And then you have the Siege of Fallujah, which, yeah, it was smaller geographically speaking, but it was still hugely significant because of how many lives were lost and the impact that it had on the whole region.
Absolutely. It was a major turning point in the Iraq War, which,
Mhm.
it's a whole other very brutal and controversial chapter in recent history. The siege itself was just incredibly intense.
Yeah.
Heavy casualties on all sides.
Mm-hmm.
The city was left in ruins,
Yeah.
and it just made the tensions between the U.S.-led forces and the Iraqi people even worse.
Right.
It's a tough one to think about.
It is. It is. These events, even though they're centuries apart, they show how humans just constantly struggle for power and territory and ideology.
Yeah.
And they remind us that conflict, it doesn't matter how big or small, it always has these long-lasting effects. But November 8th isn't all about just conflict and upheaval. It's also a date where we see cultural exchange and these moments of real innovation. Like, remember the opening of the Louvre Museum in 1793?
Oh, yeah.
That was huge, not just for France, but for the whole world. It really democratized art and made it so everyone could enjoy it, not just the wealthy elite.
Imagine, regular people walking through those incredible halls for the first time, seeing these masterpieces that had been locked away in royal palaces.
Right.
It's such a testament to the power of art, how it can inspire and educate and bring people together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then looking at the global scale, we have Japan's victory in the AFC Asian Cup in 1992.
Right.
It wasn't just about sports. It was really a reflection of Japan coming back as a major player on the world stage.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier how you're fascinated by how countries rebuild after these periods of conflict. And Japan in the 20th century is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
They went from this utter devastation of World War II to becoming this economic powerhouse and a leader in technology.
Right.
And that victory in the Asian Cup, it was like a symbol of that national resurgence.
Totally. And it really goes to show you how sports can go beyond just competition
For sure.
and become this source of national pride and unity, especially for countries that have been through really tough times.
Absolutely.
Another aspect of November 8th that I find really fascinating is how it connects us to the lives of these individuals who really shaped our world.
Right.
We've got scientists, authors, artists, political figures,
Right.
all born or dying on this day.
It's like we get these glimpses into these different parts of human achievement.
Exactly.
Like, take Edmund Halley, the astronomer, who was born on November 8, 1656.
Right.
He wasn't just, looking at stars. He was figuring out their secrets.
Right.
He calculated the orbit of Halley's Comet, which has captivated humans forever.
Yeah.
And because of him, our understanding of the universe, our place in it, grew.
Yeah.
And then you have Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, also born on the same date in 1847.
Oh, yeah.
He really tapped into our deepest fears,
Uh-huh.
explored that dark side of human nature.
Right.
He wrote about the anxieties of a world that was changing so rapidly, and his novel, Dracula, is still relevant today. We think about all the adaptations and interpretations that we still have.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It really is. It's fascinating how he took all these anxieties about disease and sexuality that clash between tradition and modernity and turned it into this gothic horror story that just never gets old.
Totally.
And we can't forget Margaret Mitchell, born on November 8, 1900. Her book, Gone with the Wind, won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
And it really captured the chaos and the heartbreak of the American Civil War and everything that came after.
Yeah.
It's this epic story about love and loss and resilience in the face of just like massive historical upheaval.
It's a good reminder that even in the middle of all that destruction, the human spirit finds a way to keep going.
It really does. And then, of course, we have these significant deaths on November 8th, too,
Right.
which remind us that even the greatest lives have to come to an end.
Yeah, John Milton, the English poet known for Paradise Lost, died on this date in 1674.
Right.
His epic poem, which, it's about good and evil and free will and what it means to be human, is still considered one of the best pieces of English literature.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It shows you how powerful language can be
Yeah.
and how deep human thought can go.
Yeah. And then in 1953, Ivan Bunin, the Russian author and Nobel Prize winner, he passed away on this date, too.
Yeah.
His work was all about the complicated relationships between people and trying to find meaning in a world that was constantly changing.
His writing is rooted in that really turbulent history of Russia.
Right.
It's like a window into a world that was on the verge of a revolution. And it explores these universal themes of love and loss and just what it means to be human.
Exactly. And finally, in 2009, Vitaly Ginzburg, who was this brilliant Russian physicist and a Nobel laureate, died on November 8th.
Right.
And his groundbreaking work in condensed matter physics has really had a lasting impact on science.
His work on superconductivity and superfluidity helped lead to so many technological advances that are still shaping our world today.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's a reminder that scientific progress builds on the work of all those who came before.
Absolutely. So when we look back at all these events and all these individuals, what do you think is particularly relevant to our own time?
It's so interesting how history often repeats itself. The problems that societies faced in the past, conflict, political upheaval, all these advancements in technology, we're dealing with all the same stuff today.
Yeah.
And the people we talked about, the artists, the writers, the scientists, the leaders, they show us that human creativity, that ingenuity, it's always played a part in making the world what it is.
It's almost like we're looking in a mirror when we look at the past, seeing reflections of our present in those events.
Yeah, I get that.
Wow, it's kind of hard to believe we just went through centuries of history all focused on one date, November 8th.
I know, right? It's like we've seen this incredible tapestry of human experience, from these huge empires to the small personal moments in individual lives.
And we've seen these themes pop up again and again. The fight for power, how conflict changes things, the resilience of humans, and how ideas can shape the world.
Like those efforts to modernize the Ottoman Empire. Remember, back in 1864, they were trying to, completely overhaul their administration system.
Yeah, it's like a textbook example of how these big institutions, even empires, try to adapt when everything around them is changing.
Exactly. And it makes you think about questions that are still relevant today. Like, how do societies deal with modernization and globalization? How do you balance holding on to traditions while moving forward?
Right, right. And those controversial events like, Jerusalem being declared Israel's capital in 1949 or the siege of Fallujah in 2004, they really make you think about how complicated our world is.
Yeah, they force us to face these tough truths about power and ideology and the cost of conflict. And they make us look at our own beliefs and biases.
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and names. It's about understanding what shapes our world and learning from the choices, good and bad, that people made before us.
Yeah, it's like connecting the dots, seeing the patterns, and understanding how the past is still shaping us today.
It's easy to get caught up in our own lives, but taking this deep dive into November 8th throughout history has really shown me how important it is to, zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely. It's about realizing that we're all part of this huge historical story that's still being written. And everything we do, even the small things, can change how that story unfolds.
So as we wrap up this trip through time, I want to leave you with this. What will your mark on the story of November 8th be?
How will you use what you've learned from the past to make a better future?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it made you curious and inspired you to keep exploring the amazing story of history.